All India Radio, Bangalore, Mysore, and Bhadravati. Tonight we bring a talk by Admiral O.S. Dawson on his long and eventful years in the Indian Navy.
The 30th of November this year will make a decade since I retired from the Navy, and I look back with nostalgia the time I spent in the Navy, the silent service. Even as a child, I was fascinated and drawn magnetically towards water. When silence prevailed in the household, my parents would conclude that I must be occupied with paper boats and buckets of water. That initial bond with water soon developed into an overpowering spiritual force which was to rule my destiny and guide me to the pinnacle every seaman yearns for. My adventurous tenure on the rough seas had their beginnings in neighboring Burma, now called Myanmar. Born and educated in that country, where my father was in the education service, gave me opportunities to come in contact with riverine and seagoing vessels. Very often I would slip away from school and find my way on board vessels berthed in the ports of Rangoon and Moulmein. The sea had cast a spell on me. I had my lifelong ambition very clearly defined, and what could be a better way to recount that ambition in the words of the poet laureate John Masefield? I quote, "I must go to the seas, to the lonely sea and the sky, and all I ask is a tall ship and a star to guide her by. I must go to the seas for the call of the running tide, a white call and a clear call that may not be denied." I always had a soft corner for the merchant navy and wanted to be a marine engineer. I would make friends with the engineers on board who would permit me to keep a watch with them at sea. In 1939, I had decided to join the Indian mercantile marine training ship Dufferin. However, this was not to be. I had yet to complete my high school education. Besides, World War II had broken out. My father also frowned upon my preference for ships to books. Mother never liked the sea and considered it dark and cold. I was initiated into a disciplined life under the strict eyes of my father even before I had joined the Navy. While at Moulmein at the age of 16, I had joined the Burma Auxiliary Force. I served in a 303 Vickers machine gun section of the Tenasserim Battalion. When the Japanese entered the war, this battalion was embodied and we found ourselves on the border between Burma and Siam, now Thailand. We were employed in setting up defenses. My father was transferred to Chaukpu on Ramri Island, and we went along. We abandoned our home at Chaukpu and evacuated to India when the Japanese invaded and occupied the country in 1942. I was coming to India for the first time. Whilst at Madras, I went to the British India Steam Navigation Company, and there I met a lieutenant of the RINVR, who was the second in command of the Tenasserim Battalion. He dissuaded me from joining the Merchant Navy and suggested joining the Royal Indian Navy. On 7th of January 1943, I entered the Royal Indian Naval Volunteer Reserves as a midshipman and commenced training at Castle Barracks at Bombay. The Royal Indian Navy comprised of regular officers who were trained in Britain and considered themselves superior. The next were the Naval Reserves from the Merchant Navy. We from the Volunteer Reserves formed the bulk of the officer cadre, and the majority of us were consigned to coastal forces, minesweepers, and to amphibious forces. These forces were further trained to undertake combined and clandestine operations. We were to make first contact with opposing forces on the beaches, rivers, and creeks in Burma and Southeast Asia. The high attrition rate of casualties was a foregone conclusion. We became known as the Expendables. After spending about a year in coastal forces, I was transferred to HMIS Jamna. I was glad to be on a bigger ship and that too a modern sloop. I began to feel the realization of my ambition. While on Jamna, I began to derive solace from the biblical quote, "They that go down the seas in ships see the wonders of the Lord." I realized that the sea is a cruel taskmaster. It favors the brave and eliminates the weak. India was now the center of military activities for the invasion of Burma and reconquest of Southeast Asia. Whilst on convoy escort duty in the Bay of Bengal, our ship went to the aid of MV Asphalia, which had been torpedoed and was listing heavily in the rough sea. The survivors of the ill-fated ship were rescued, and the dead were buried at sea. I flashed back to the words in the Bible, "In the midst of life, we are in death." In early 1944, Jamna was to join a force of Royal Navy destroyers and sloops. We carried out intensive training in support of amphibious operations on the west coast of Burma. I was given accelerated promotion to acting sub-lieutenant. My knowledge in Burmese was now to come in handy. We had sailed to Akab under cover of darkness. Intelligence reports indicated that the Japanese had installed large radar-controlled guns along the coast, and we were sent to carry out reconnaissance. We found that the reports were highly exaggerated, but we were subjected to an intense bombing raid by Jap Zero fighter bombers. The air defense from the ships made it impossible for the bombers to get near their targets. Soon we moved in support of the army and cut off the remaining Japanese in and around Akyab. During the war, the experience I gained from the men who were in command and their professional toughness soon became ingrained in me. When World War II concluded, I served on a Banger-class minesweeper. We were involved in mine-clearing operations in the Malacca Straits and around the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. In the wake of independence in 1947 and partition, all personnel of the Navy were given the option to remain in India or to go to Pakistan. The assets of the Navy were also divided, and both the Indian and Pakistan navies came into being. The name Royal Indian Navy continued till 1950, and on India becoming a republic, it was renamed Indian Navy. My seagoing appointments continued till 1948, when I was sent to England for specialization in navigation and fighter direction. This was the closest I got to flying. I am still wistful about my unfulfilled dream to be a flyer. On my return from England, I was appointed to INS Jamna. With breaks between my seagoing appointments, I served ashore as an instructor in the navigation school, staff officer operations, and later as chief staff officer and director of tactical school at Cochin. Here I had much to contribute to the Navy. The highlight of my appointment was as a captain when I was Director of Naval Operations at Naval Headquarters, New Delhi. It was during this time Karachi was stormed by the Indian Navy. I played the crucial role of planning and directing the Indian Navy's daunting role in the war. At this time, I came in contact with the Prime Minister, Mrs. Gandhi. Her political directions were clear and her grasp of military matters praiseworthy. I remained throughout in the war room. I was awarded the Ati Vishesh Seva Medal for my role during the Indo-Pak War. Another assignment which floods me with memories was when I was selected as ADC to President Dr. Rajendra Prasad. Being different from the naval appointments, it was a little difficult at times, but I got to meet some very eminent people like Chou En-lai, Richard Nixon, and President Tito. I also came in close contact with Panditji. I also met Mrs. Gandhi, Panditji's official hostess, coordinating important functions. She was a humanist. I went back to serve at sea in INS Delhi and Vikrant. My most enjoyable stints at sea were on board INS Talwar as commanding officer when the ship was to escort our first submarine INS Kalvari from Riga. I also commanded INS Nilgiri. Later in 1978, I commanded the Eastern Fleet. I was happy to be operating on the eastern seaboard. Between 1976 and 78, I was the general manager of Goa shipyard, and here I gained valuable experience. I evolved a corporate plan which, though not fully developed, sees the shipyard as a modern shipyard and a full order book. As Flag Officer Commanding in Chief Southern Naval Command, Cochin, I had 2 naval air stations in the command. I was more than excited dealing with various types of aircraft. I laid considerable stress on the operational readiness and made good progress. It was during this tenure that I conceptualized the Karwar Naval Base and the Naval Academy at Elimalai in Kerala. I was awarded the Param Vishit Seva Medal for Distinguished Service of Exceptional Order on Republic Day 1981. Becoming Chief of Naval Staff in 1982, I had crossed the last hurdle in my career. My concern now was the well-being of the entire Navy. I took a lot of steps towards total realization of the Indian Ocean problem, which is no more an ocean of tranquility. The seas had become more contentious, with everyone eyeing hidden wealth underneath. I made a thrust towards indigenous technology and attempted to draw the right fellows into the mainstream of the Navy. As the chief, I sat on a very lonely chair, since I had to take all the decisions. Before taking decisions, I was always open to opinions and suggestions, but I did not believe in wasting time through persuasion. I believed in shock therapy. However, as in boxing, I never hit below the belt, but straight. The growth of the Navy was uppermost in my mind. As my tenure came to an end, I was left with a tinge of sadness. For 42 years, the Navy was my home, and I learnt never to underestimate the power of the sea. As naval officers, we saw ourselves as confident, capable, loyal, calm, and courageous, completely in control. When our decisions involved own life or death during combat or emergencies, we often assumed a glacial calm and an apparent icy indifference to our own stake in the outcome. We were fatalists in our professional approach. We are now midway in the last decade of this century, and history will move into the 21st century. Certain events that have happened during the last few years of the 20th century compel our attention. It may be too much to describe them as signs of hope in a century of despair, but they are indeed significant pointers to life in the 21st century.
You were listening to Admiral O.S. Dawson on his long and eventful years in the Indian Navy. This program came to you from the Bangalore studios of All India Radio.